To say the Russian army lacks numbers is always going to be a controversial statement. After all, when the public thinks about military strength, often they think about the big budget platform items. The tanks, the armoured personnel carriers, the artillery pieces, the aircraft, and naval vessels. But that's not the only barometer of military strength. Modern militaries are combined armed forces. They're complex machines, and they require multiple tools in order to get the best out of themselves. And one tool which has never gone obsolete throughout many millennia of human military development is the humble infantryman. Because to this day, there remain missions that only the infantry foot slogger with their rifle or their machine gun can do. Good luck running hostage rescue in a tank. Good luck clearing a building with an artillery piece if you want the building there at the end of the show. Infantry remain absolutely critical to the efficacy of militaries in the field. It's only them that can take ground and control it. They're also vital for protecting those big ticket items. Tanks, artillery, APCs are only so much scrap metal if you don't have the infantry to protect them from threats. Russia went into the Ukraine conflict with huge amounts of armoured materiel. They went in with the tanks, the jets, the APCs, and the artillery pieces. And to be fair, we also thought they had the infantry. Russia showed off advanced infantry forces before the Ukraine crisis. We saw people in advanced combat gear. We saw their vaunted airborne forces, like Sergeant Never Skips Gym Day over here with his 2 PKMs. We were expecting a powerful, competent, combined arms force that combined infantry, tanks, and artillery. Which means we're left with a question. But after the first phases of the Ukrainian war, we were left asking a question as we saw unsupported Russian armour being picked off by Ukrainian light infantry. We were left with the question of where was the Russian infantry? And why were we instead seeing pictures like this of old, crippled, under-equipped individuals fighting for Russia on the front lines? We were also left with a wide range of other questions. And of course, the first instinct for many was to jump to the conclusion that the Russian army must be a bunch of idiots. They clearly had forgotten to protect their supply lines from Ukrainian raiders and light infantry. They had forgotten that tanks sometimes needed infantry support in order to survive. People weren't able to understand why the Russians were struggling so much in urban centres and agglomerations. Why were they struggling to clear suburbs and cities and small towns? And there were a bunch of smaller questions that emerged as well. Why were we seeing photos from the Russian side of incredibly obsolete equipment like Mosin Nagants and old kit being pressed into service? Why were casualty claims that the Ukrainians were claiming so much higher than what the Russians were admitting to? Why was there talk of vast numbers of conscripts fighting on the Russian side even after Vladimir Putin came out and said the Russians wouldn't be using conscripts anymore? And why were the Ukrainians claiming to be outnumbered given what we knew about the size of the Russian army? The answer, I think, is a little less simplistic than saying the Russians don't know what they're doing. In fact, my contention today is going to be something more like this. The Russian army has too much metal and not enough grunts. It's got too many tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles relative to the number of infantry soldiers that it can put into the field. And I'm going to go through the reasons why that is. And because they are short of infantry, exactly when they need it the most, they're resorting to very extreme measures in terms of pulling in proxy forces, mercenaries, Chechens, and anyone they can get their hands on in order to make up the numbers. So what am I going to be covering today? I'm going to look at infantry, the requirement for them, and their place in the Russian army. I'm going to talk about what the fact that Russia has designated this a special military operation means, because really that's at the heart of a lot of the trouble we're seeing. Then I'm going to talk about the reasons for Russian infantry shortages, how Russia is trying to get around those shortages, with a particularly detailed look at the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic and their forces, because I think they're often forgotten in a lot of the media coverage, and finally ask the question about what that all means. A note there on Ukraine. This video is going to be on the Russian side of the conflict. The reason is the problems facing the Russian army almost diametrically opposed to many of the problems facing the Ukrainian army. As a result, when I want to talk about Ukrainian mobilization and their difficulties, that'll serve in its own video. I also want to stress the obvious. Saying that the Russians are having difficulty or suffer from a problem in this regard doesn't mean that I'm predicting that the Russians are going to lose or that the Russians have a terrible army. I'm simply making observations around a problem that the Russians are facing, just as I will when I eventually get to the Ukrainians. So, let's talk about the infantry soldier, their role generally in battle and specifically their role in the Russian army. The first thing to say is that we tend to place great emphasis on platforms. The tanks, the artillery, the expensive pieces of technology that love getting camera time and that politicians love to point to because they're the big lines in the budget, where you can purchase a bunch of them and say you're being strong on defense. The Russian army admittedly places a huge stock on its armoured vehicles. Its tank fleet is the largest in the world if you include their claimed reserves. But those platforms, the tanks and the artillery pieces, they struggle without supporting infantry. Infantry is a critical supporting arm for tanks. And if you think about this for a couple of minutes, the reasons become obvious. Being inside a metal box is an inherently limiting thing. You might have optics and a fire control system that enable you to fire out to the horizon or see at night. But good luck getting 40 or 50 tons of metal up a staircase in order to clear the third floor of an apartment. And if you trundle down a street, there's nothing stopping someone who's hiding on the third floor of that apartment leaning out a window and putting a rocket into the back of your tank, kind of like we're seeing in the image on the top right. Platforms like this require infantry. They need infantry to go into broken and disrupted terrain, to close with and destroy the enemy, to prevent enemy light infantry getting close and ambushing them with the kind of rocket systems and missile systems that we've seen make it into Ukraine. There's a symbiotic relationship here, wherein all the other arms require the infantry in order to do their jobs. That job being protecting the infantry and providing it fire support so it can carry out its job. And this maxim perhaps was never more true than during the open days of the Ukrainian war, because terrain really matters. When you're driving a tank or an armoured vehicle, there are some terrains that can make tank drivers really, really sad. Urban agglomerations, so towns, cities, they're probably first on the list, because like I said, while a tank can see out to the horizon, it can't see inside a building, it can't climb a staircase, it can't clear a rooftop, and it can't see what's hiding down an alleyway, down a side street, or on the third floor of an apartment building. Sometimes it's as simple as the fact that a tank gun can't do much good if you can't elevate it high enough to knock out some infantry that are hiding 25 metres away on a building rooftop. Heavy forest is similar. It cuts down view lines and it limits movement. Tanks are designed to be all-terrain vehicles. They thrive on being able to be mobile, use terrain. They're off-road vehicles, essentially. But in heavy forested areas, they're usually pressed onto roads, which makes them easy to ambush and limits their situational awareness. Close fortifications are similar. If you have a deep trench system and infantry can hide in them until the tanks trundle past, and then they can pop up and use their missile systems, well, then the drivers of those tanks are going to be A, very unhappy, B, surprised, and C, on their way to, as the chieftain would say, a significant emotional event, the first time they get a rocket in the relatively underprotected rear of their vehicle. Mud, of course, is another bane of their existence, because the one thing every tank driver doesn't want to do is to be stuck on a road, because when you're on a road, everyone knows where you're going to be and you're relatively easy to ambush and bracket. You've got no maneuverability. So, of course, if you think about the terrain in Ukraine during the opening stages of the Russian invasion, the Russians attacked during mud season through heavily forested areas into urban agglomerations that were often heavily fortified. So in the opening stages of this conflict, there was a huge premium on infantry to be there for armoured support, to get into Ukrainian buildings, to clear towns and cities, to fight in the suburbs of cities like Kyiv. And while the switch to other fronts brought some relief, the issue remains that while you can shell a town into absolute oblivion, while that you can move tanks up to certain positions and fire from a distance, you can't actually seize territory. You can't clear buildings. You can't secure a town until a man with a rifle goes in and declares that he controls that territory now. This is not a new problem. Armies have known that armoured vehicles can't really exist without infantry support as far back as World War II and to an extent as far back as World War I. During World War II, the Americans, the British, the Germans, and the Soviet Union all practiced close infantry cooperation tactics. All of them developed methods for getting the infantry to battle alongside the tanks, whether that in the case of the Soviet Union being tankovый descent tactics, where you have the infantry ride on the tanks and then jump off them close to the field of battle, or whether you carry the infantry behind them in motorized units, so in trucks. The point was, whenever tanks got separated from the infantry, they tended to be absolutely picked apart by anti-tank weapons, which is an experience that hasn't really changed. And to pretend Russia doesn't know this is to be intellectually dishonest. And I want to illustrate this by talking about the main unit that everyone has been talking about in the Ukrainian war, the Battalion Tactical Group. So here's a word that has sort of entered the public lexicon since the Russian-Ukrainian war broke out. A Battalion Tactical Group is a Russian military unit of roughly 600 to 800 men that's designed to be an all-arms force. It's designed to have a little bit of everything in it. So if you think about the tools you need to carry out a military operation, the idea is that a BTG will be sprinkled with a little bit of everything. It's got some tanks, it's got some artillery, it's got some support weapons, it's got some air defense, and of course, it's got a lot of organic infantry in it. And the primary vehicle, the primary weapon system in the BTG isn't actually the tank. In fact, infantry fighting vehicles outnumber tanks by about a 4-to-1 ratio nominally. And for those of you who don't know what an IFV is, or an infantry fighting vehicle, or an APC, these are basically vehicles that are armoured, less heavily armoured than tanks, and less heavily armed than tanks, but have a lot of space inside them, and their job is to carry infantry to the field of battle, support the infantry on the field, so that the infantry can do the infantry's jobs, which is to protect the tanks and to take terrain and do the other critical jobs that the infantry fills. And the logic here seems pretty sound. The West knew about this Russian structure for years in advance, and no one really wrote it off. It seems like a sensible approach, wherein you have a good number of infantry that are mounted in vehicles who can keep up with your armour, and they're supported by a decent number of support weapons, including self-propelled artillery and air defences. Which leads to this question of what on earth is going on? Why in the early war were we getting huge amounts of visual evidence that tanks, seemingly without infantry cover, were being subject to close ambushes, which is an ambush delivered at short range, by Ukrainian light infantry, who were able to hide in wait and then ambush Russian vehicles? Why were we getting reports from the Ukrainians that they were taking out infantry fighting vehicles that should have been full of Russian troops that were partly or indeed fully empty? Why was there a seeming shortage of Russian infantry when it came to assaulting urban areas, such that the Russians sometimes felt the need to push tanks almost unsupported into these areas? Now, I will admit we need to be careful with our evidence here. It is obviously incomplete, and I'm also not saying that there was no infantry support for Russian armour. We have plenty of videos of Russian tanks operating in close cooperation with infantry. But we've also got video evidence to the contrary and evidence from both sides' accounts to the contrary, which leads to the question, if the Russians are nominally meant to have infantry supporting their tanks, why on earth were so many of their tanks sent in without appropriate infantry support and left to be destroyed by Ukrainian forces as a result? In other words, where are the Russian infantry? And our opening point begins with this: Vladimir Putin's decision to conduct a, quote, special military operation in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin did not declare war on the state of Ukraine, and that's a really significant thing. Let's be clear, Russia does have very serious mobilization potential. The Russian military has prepared for many, many years to fight a large, drawn-out war. But this is not the war that it has prepared to fight. Russia not being at war means a number of things. It can't call up its masses and masses of secondary reservists. It has a limited pool of people who are eligible to be called up, but it can't call on the vast numbers of people who have previously done their conscript service who could be pushed into uniform. It means that the conscripts within Russia's military units can't go into battle. And as a result, the Russian army is essentially fighting in its peacetime configuration. The Russian army was not designed to fight this way. The Russian army didn't train to fight this way. This is a force that prepared for a knockdown, drawn-out fight with NATO, where it would mobilize and fight the combined forces of the West. And that's just not what it's doing in Ukraine. So as I go through these 6 reasons that Russia is experiencing a severe infantry shortage, please keep this context in mind. And while I want to stress again, I have no proof of to what extent the infantry deficit has driven Russian performance on the battlefield, I've identified 6 reasons that help explain why that deficit might be there. And the first is a really simple one. The army's too bloody small. Ukraine's a really big place with a reasonably large army. It had a pre-war population of about 40 million. Everywhere in the media you'll hear about this 3-to-1 attacker to defender ratio that you're meant to have in order to make reasonable progress while reducing casualty counts. I think a lot of people agree that that ratio is oversimplified and overused. But if you applied it to the context of the Ukrainian invasion, depending on what you count as a Ukrainian defender between non-reservists or reservists or combat units or non-combat units, you end up with a required Russian invasion force that's at least 600,000 strong. And that's not counting potential occupation duties. Russians will in fact, or pro-Russian sources will in fact sometimes use this as proof that the Russians never intended to take Kyiv. I would point out that the Russians were able to take Crimea with a very limited number of troops. They were able to start the Donetsk uprising with a very limited number of troops. Their assumptions around Ukrainian resistance levels were just clearly circa 2014 rather than 2022. Anyway, moving on. Russia didn't have anything close to 600,000 troops. The entire Russian ground forces were only about 280,000 strong before this crisis. Now, I put an asterisk there for a reason. The asterisk is there because not every unit in the Russian ground forces is suitable for use in an invasion like this one. There are some rear-line administrative units that have no place being on the front line or indeed even supporting an invasion. And as much as some people with cruel senses of humour might find it funny if Igor from accounting or Pavel from procurement and contracting got sent from his cushy job in Moscow to make up infantry numbers in the invasion of Ukraine, that's probably not a reliable source of infantry combat power. So using the overall number of the Russian ground forces is always a little bit suspect. At the same time, there are sources of infantry that you can find in Russia outside the ground forces. The naval infantry, one very clear example of an infantry-like force that isn't found within the ground forces, which is why the Russian invasion force has been augmented with naval infantry, with airborne, with units from Rosgvardia, so counter-terrorist units have been deployed to Ukraine to support the regular army. But nonetheless, there is a big gap between the standing size of the Russian army and the task that it was set, which was to invade, occupy, and subdue, to a significant degree, the nation of Ukraine. The second point, and I know this is going to sound strange to say, but the Russian army is not actually at war, and that's really important. The Russian army was conceived, it was designed for a knockdown, drawn-out fight with NATO. And as a result, it operates as a tiered readiness force. So what is this? This basically means that most Russian units aren't manned 100% all the time. They have maybe 70% to 80 or even 90% of their personnel, but it's not 100%. And the idea is that in the event of war or war being imminent, you call up a bunch of reservists and the reservists fill out those units and you get to 100% manning. Because no one's going to fight NATO with a peacetime army. In the meantime, the forces that you have there during peacetime, they can keep the equipment running, they can maintain the unit, and they can deal with small regional or local contingencies without having to call up the reserves. But Ukraine isn't really a small local contingency. And then you've got a mixture of conscripts and contract soldiers within these brigades. But the idea is basically, if a brigade has a hypothetical wartime strength of 3,500, at 70% readiness, there's actually only 2,450 blokes in the unit, and that's a problem. And then there's the problem that because Russia doesn't have enough contract soldiers, the units themselves have been shrinking even beyond what was originally their authorized established strength. Russia has long had difficulty attracting enough professional full-time contract soldiers to fill the number of BTGs that it's created. The number of BTGs has continuously increased over the last several years. But the last time Russia stopped disclosing the number of contractors it had 405,000. That's not enough. It's not enough to fill every contract position in the aerospace forces, in the Navy, in the Army. It's not enough to go around. So as a result, the theoretical strength of some of these units is shrinking. Motorized rifle battalions have shrunk from between 461 and 539 personnel to something like 345. They've gotten smaller in order to make the number of BTGs increase. Kind of like how Mussolini increased the number of divisions in the Italian army by just making every division smaller. It doesn't make the force more powerful, it just increases a number on a page. And the other problem is that having shrunk those forces, many of these units then don't even receive their full establishment of personnel. So you have a force that is less than 70% manned at a manning level that is lower than it probably should be. And that leads into issue 4. And the problem this leads to is that while they've downsized the number of men, they haven't downsized the number of vehicles. So Kaufman observes that a motor rifle platoon in the Russian army might have 3 squads of 7 men, which sounds small but reasonable. You account for the actual manning levels of these units and you come down to a squad size of 5 to 6. 5 to 6 troops operating out of each individual infantry transporting vehicle. But here's the problem. That's not the number of dismounts. 3 of those guys needs to operate the vehicle in question. You need a commander, you need a driver, you need a gunner. And you can't just, park the vehicle in the middle of the Ukraine. That's like parking a vehicle in the worst neighborhood imaginable. Bad things are going to happen to it. You can't abandon your vehicle. So you can see the problem here. If you need 3 guys out of 5 to man the vehicle, that leaves 2 infantry dismounts in each vehicle. At the extreme example, we've had observations of there being Russian BTR BMPs, which are those infantry transporting vehicles, having only their crew of 3, no dismounts. Which means counterintuitively, you can end up with mechanized infantry units, the units that are meant to provide the infantry to protect the tanks, with no dismountable infantry. It's an infantry unit that doesn't have infantry because they're all too busy being glued to or stuck to their vehicles. 2 men do not make an acceptable dismounted fighting team. It doesn't matter if those 2 dismounts are Sergeant Besepsky, the 7'2" Verev Superman who never skips leg day, and his colleague who dual wields PKMs. It doesn't matter. They're not going to have the situational awareness. They don't have the numbers to do common infantry tasks, like stacking up and clearing a building or providing security for an element. And because problems like this always compound, it's made worse by the way the Russian army is forced to organize itself because of this conscript contract troop divide. So you've got contractors who serve for a number of years, you've got conscripts who are in for 1 year and they're almost certainly out. It's natural in an army and in a military to teach the contract troops, the professionals, the more technical support and enabler roles. You kind of don't want to teach Private Conscriptovic how to operate the advanced air defense or electronic warfare system. One, because by the time you finish training him on it, his service is almost done. And two, do you really want to take the less motivated guy who's there on $30 a month and put him in that control cabin there and tell him that he's now in charge of the $25 million air defense system? Also, please don't shoot down any of our $80 million jets and cause a friendly fire incident. So you don't put Private Conscriptovic in the advanced air defense system. You put the professional contract soldiers in them, and you rely on the conscripts to make up the dumb grunt roles, because it doesn't take as long to teach a guy how to hold a Kalashnikov and shoot at anything that has a Ukrainian armband on it. For those of you who might have really enjoyed Top Gun, let me put it this way. If the shit hits the fan and you will get your call-up notices informing you that you've been conscripted to fight World War III, you're not ending up in a cockpit. You're not ending up flying an F-18 or an F-35, no matter how many hours you have clocked in a flight simulator. Your ass is ending up driving a truck, working logistics, or hucking a rifle on the front line of a battlefield, because there's not going to be time or an impetus to teach reservists or hastily conscripted troops how to serve in the most technical roles in a military. It just doesn't make sense. Now, this actually sounds very reasonable. This is a sensible decision from a manning perspective. You don't want to waste all your training continuously cycling conscripts through the most technical roles. I mean, if I say the words conscript nuclear weapons operators, I'm probably going to give at least some of you nightmares. The problem is, in peacetime, the Russian army can't or has said they will not deploy conscripts to Ukraine. They won't force the conscripts to go. So you remember, you have these units, these battalion tactical groups that have a mixture of conscript and non-conscript personnel. If you can't deploy the conscript, that hypothetical 2,450 becomes 1,715. You've got to leave the conscripts behind. And the problem is, the conscripts are the ones who are meant to be doing a lot of the infantry grunt work, which means the air defense systems go, the tankers go, the support services go, the artillery goes, but a lot of the IFEs are going without their grunts. They're going without their riflemen. And finally, this problem is made even worse by the way the early campaign played out. Remember, I'm not saying that the Russian army are idiots. It's not that they don't have infantry or that they don't understand the importance of their infantry. Russia's got pocket-specific units that are heavily weighted towards contract professional infantry soldiers. That's what they do. So the VDV, the airborne forces, are only they have light armour, but they are primarily an airborne infantry fighting force. The naval infantry likewise. So the problem is a lot of these units were sent in really early in this campaign to do really high risk and dangerous stuff, and they got really badly chewed up as a result. So tracking VDV casualties, for example, is famous and relatively easy. We've got a number of officer obituaries that let us track where these units were and where their officers have taken casualties. And because the VDV uses very distinctive equipment, we can look at where the airborne equipment has been destroyed and in what quantities. So there's about 150 BMDs, which are airborne infantry transport vehicles that have been destroyed, visually confirmed in Ukraine. And we can use that to determine and confirm where the VDV was and what sort of casualties it was probably taking. Hostomel is very famous. And here's the point. It doesn't matter whether you believe the Russian reports that the VDV dropped and they gunned down 10 Ukrainians for every one of their own before they died. The point is they died. And every trained infantryman that Russia loses is a valuable commodity that further unbalances the remaining force. The naval infantry likewise. The Russian naval infantry have been called out even by Western sources as having performed relatively well in many of the fights that they have been in. They've been present on the southern front particularly in a number of locations. But we've got proof. We've got obituaries from every single brigade and regiment of the Russian naval infantry showing that the Russians admit that they have had casualties from these units. They've suffered. So what you have is, because the Russians are short on infantry, they've heavily deployed the forces they have that are heavy on infantry. Those forces have been chewed up, which just makes the underlying problem even worse moving forward. All right, so in order to fully capture the Genius of Vladimir Putin. Let's just take it back a step and bring this all together. You start with an army that is fundamentally too small, that does not have enough infantry, does not have enough manpower in it in order to do the mission that you have assigned it. There are not enough troops in the Russian army, even at a wartime standing, even with Rosgvardia and the maritime infantry and the airborne infantry, to attack Kyiv and Sumy and Kharkiv and in the south and in the Donbass simultaneously and defeat the Ukrainians on all those fronts and hold territory. Then you tell the army that is already too small that it cannot stand up to wartime standing. The Russian army always planned to go from 70 or 80% manning to 100% manning in time of war. Well, you tell it no, it's going with the 70 or 80% that it has, and even better, it's leaving the conscript share of those units at home, so it's not even going with the 70 or 80% that it has. This is hampered by the fact that you already have been shaving down unit sizes in the lead up to this war, so that every person who is meant to be on the roster in case of war who is missing actually represents a serious diminishment of the strength of the unit. But of course, that doesn't stop you taking all the vehicles with you anyway. So now you end up with armoured personnel carriers that have no infantry in them, despite that being their job, or who have so few infantry in them that they can't realistically and effectively do their jobs. This is all made worse, of course, by the fact that those conscripts that you left at home are overly concentrated in arms that are really important to us right now, like the infantry and the truck drivers, the arms that are really, really important for enabling the tanks and the advanced systems to actually do their job. And then you bring it all together by getting a lot of the infantry you have, including a lot of the elite infantry you have, killed or wounded or mauled in the opening stages of the operation, which leaves you in a pretty bad place. You're left with a force that has a lot of artillery, which we're seeing the Russians make a lot of use of, a lot of tanks, a lot of support elements, but is short on the infantry that you need to close with and destroy the enemy, to seize urban terrain, to break into fortifications, to carry on the war. So what have the Russians tried to do in order to deal with this problem? Because it's not like they're ignoring it. The first point is shadow mobilization, so-called. So the idea here is that the Russians are trying to fill the ranks quietly without resorting to a legal call-up of all of their reservists. So there's a number of ways to do this. They're calling up reservists for compulsory training, which they can do, and then they're offering very sweet contracts. And they're also going out to economically depressed regions or rural areas of Russia, and they're offering very large enlistment and pay bonuses for those that are willing to sign up to be contract soldiers and get deployed to Ukraine. And when I say a lot of money, I mean a lot of money. In terms of income, Russia is one of the most income unequal places on the earth. We know that countries like the United States have inequality problems. In Russia, it's far, far worse. So you can easily go to these areas, these economically depressed areas of Russia, and offer an annual salary on a monthly basis. And in these areas with high unemployment or limited opportunities, people are likely to take it. One observation I'll add here is that the casualties that Russia has disclosed, in terms of the obituaries we have seen, are very heavily skewed towards ethnic minority or economically depressed areas. Buryatia and Tuva are massively overrepresented in terms of disclosed Russian casualties to date. The Ukrainians have observed, and the Russian-owned declarations seem to support the idea that there's an awful lot of ethnic minority soldiers being killed for the Russian army in Ukraine. And then we've got everyone's favourite TikTok warriors, Wagner Group and also Kadyrov's Chechens. Now, these have been relatively small contingents compared to the overall size of the Russian army, but they've been present at major fronts. Now, the Chechens are admittedly famous for producing TikTok videos of them firing AKs akimbo or dumping mags into empty buildings or all manner of things, but they have been present at a number of areas where the fighting has been pretty heavy, as has Wagner Group. And a few Western evaluations have gone so far as to suggest that at least the Wagner ground elements may have performed better than some of the Russian dismounts in terms of actually fighting in these urban areas. This is also a point where I'll add the reminder that Wagner Group still has a number of personnel and leaders sporting Nazi tattoos and symbols. Dmitry Utkin still has Nazi tattoos, and it's a bit ironic when you send neo-Nazis to go ostensibly denazify a country. Just never going to miss an opportunity to point that out. More problematic, I think, for Russia in the long term, but also Ukraine in the short term, is the increasing evidence that Russia is intending to cannibalize its training units. To explain here for a moment, Russian conscripts are generally sent to, not to some centralized school, but they're sent to their units to get a lot of their training. And as a result, most Russian units have battalions that are focused on training conscripts. So they have a population of trainers and training vehicles. The conscripts come in and they learn their advanced military skills in the unit. They're called third battalions. There's evidence that Russia is intending to use these third battalions that are made up of experienced trainers and their reserve vehicles and mobilizing them into additional battalion tactical groups. This is problematic. In one way, it's a massive sugar hit, so-called, for the army, because it's another source of manpower that means you might be able to pull together an extra 30 or 40 BTGs out of trainers. And trainers are generally going to be relatively experienced and capable personnel. And the vehicles are already there, so you can pull together reinforcements pretty quickly. This is a problem for Ukraine because it means the Russian army might be able to quite heavily reinforce itself over the next few months. The problem is if you then go and get all those trainers killed. To use a sports analogy, you'd have to be pretty freaking desperate to start sending in the coach and the trainers to make up for players if you were dealing with injuries. And while I'm sure it would be an absolutely terrifying prospect, the US military would have to be pretty damn desperate to send a unit made up entirely of drill sergeants into combat. Now, yes, I'm not sure if there's any force short of a nuclear strike that would be able to stop that, but still their loss would set back the training establishment for potentially years. This is something that got the Germans and the Japanese really badly during the Second World War. The Germans in particular had a terrible tendency, particularly in the Luftwaffe, to send trainers and training pilots to bolster frontline forces and then get all the trainers killed. If the Russian army has to regenerate, if it later decides it has to mobilize and provide refresher training or induct new people with no military expertise into the army, that's going to be really hard to do if you've drained your training establishment by having them fight trench wars in the Donbass. So while this is a short-term source of additional infantry manpower, it's problematic in the long term for Russia. But by far the single largest contributor to these Russian efforts to make up infantry numbers have been the forces, the conscripts and the militia of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, who have been added to the conflict first by the tens of thousands and now by the hundreds of thousands. A quick refresher first for those of you who aren't familiar with these particularly strange breakaway states. The Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are two breakaway statelets in the eastern oblasts of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. These are areas of Ukraine that had an industrial character, historical closer relationships with Russia, and a very large number of Russian speakers. There was an uprising there in April 2014. So obviously Ukraine had its revolution of dignity wherein the pro-Russian government was thrown out, and soon afterwards Russia moved into both Crimea and also sparked an uprising in these eastern oblasts. There was some frenetic fighting in April of 2014 that led to a sensible referenda in these areas where they held referenda under conditions like you see there. So, armed men supervising polling places to see whether or not residents wanted to break away from Ukraine and either join Russia or declare independence, depending on which source you follow. In many cases, the ballot papers didn't actually have an option for remaining in Ukraine. It was just join Russia or become independent, although that was by no means universal from the data that I've been able to find. There was an agreement in 2015, Minsk II, which was supposed to freeze the fighting between these sort of breakaway regions and the Ukrainian government themselves. By this point, these regions were heavily supported by Russian volunteer fighters, Cossacks, Russian army troops on leave, in inverted commas, and whatnot. They're led by some fanatically pro-Russian governments that have at various times petitioned to join Russia and basically engaged in ongoing fighting against the Ukrainian state along the truce lines from 2015 until pretty much the present day, at a constant low level of skirmishing and occasional outbursts of wider conflict. When I'm talking about these guys, I'm going to be very careful with my source because I've got some pretty confronting things to say and I'm very nervous about people claiming this is just Ukrainian propaganda. I'm actually going to focus on using pro-separatist sources and video evidence here. I've narrowed in on two individuals who are prolific on Telegram, but are undoubtedly on the separatist side. The first is Alexander Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky was a former security minister of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, which is the republic based in the Donetsk Oblast. He's currently a leader of the Vostok military unit. This guy fought at Mariupol. It's a unit of separatist fighters. And he continues to put out messages on Telegram, but he's actively engaged in fighting to this day. Then there's Igor Girkin. Girkin goes by the alias of Strelkov, so I'll call him Strelkov throughout this presentation. This guy is a Russian agent, or rather he was a Russian agent and one of the key architects of organizing the original uprising in the breakaway oblasts. Indeed, he takes a sort of morbid credit for the fact that fighting broke out as a result of his actions. Now, this guy has been charged with war crimes in relation to the downing of MH17, so you can imagine how I feel about him as an Australian. But my key point here is these are not exactly pro-Ukrainian blokes. So when they're making statements that are negative about Russia or the DPR and LPR, or positive about the Ukrainians, we have every reason to be more likely to take them at their word. So let's look at the forces of Donetsk and Lugansk, what they brought to the table, and how they helped Russia make up for its sort of infantry deficit in this conflict. So before 2022, the invasion of February, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics had an estimated 44,000 troops under arms. That's pre-general mobilization. Those are 2021 military balance figures. Now, it's hard to gauge the exact population of these areas because you don't know exactly how many people have fled, how many people are living in the Ukrainian-controlled sections versus the Russian-controlled sections. But taking a population of approximately 3 million, this gives you a mobilization ratio of 1.5%. That is, 1.5% of the population was already serving in the forces of these breakaway states when the war began, before they mobilized. That's a really high peacetime mobilization ratio. If the US adopted that, the US military would be 4.9 million strong. The Chinese military would be 21 million strong. It really is quite an impressive number. And then on top of that, before the conflict really escalated in February, Donetsk and Luhansk declared general mobilization. Unlike Russia, they actually called up their reserves and indeed people without any military experience. So general mobilization was ordered early by the leaders of the LPR, DPR. Ukraine reported they were actually widening the swath of people they were calling up pretty extensively. Ukrainian sources cite the republics expanding the age of conscription out to 65. Nothing like going into the infantry at retirement age, but there you go. No military experience required. 65 was the upper cap on the age limit, and they also dropped a whole bunch of medical exceptions. You could have serious spinal injuries, whatever. You're in. There have been charges and rumours that men in their 50s and 60s are having to hide in order to avoid the draft, and there have been cases of people with serious medical conditions included, at least according to the Ukrainians. So can we verify that? Well, in some ways, the verification is really simple. The leaders of the DPR, LPR made these statements publicly. Pushilin went on video declaring general mobilization, and since then we've had multiple corroborating sources pointing out really desperate degrees of mobilization in the DPR and LPR. There is more contention around the exact scale of numbers, training, and equipment, so I thought I'd look at those in a little more detail. So in terms of numbers, are the separatist zones actually following through on conscription? How many people have they called up? And we have really, really strong evidence that these guys have they're scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of getting troops into uniform. Strelkov described the republics as having been swept clean. Khodakovsky, who you remember leads a military unit of one of these states, talks about being given musicians from the conservatory and troops with no background in the military, no real skill or understanding what they're doing there, and having those guys push to the front. Those declarations by people who are very familiar and involved with what these separatist forces are doing matches Ukrainian observations that large numbers of men from the republics are being thrown into the fray, hopelessly unprepared. And that leads to the point of training. Ukrainians claim that many of the separatist troops have no training and extremely poor tactics. Khodakovsky backs this up to an extent. Khodakovsky says that the mobilized reserves he's getting are of very little use, and losses will be very high whenever they go into combat. He asks, what can you expect from a musician from the conservatory? Hastily staffed, no motivation, lack of ideas about military affairs. Now, Khodakovsky does say that these sort of troops are not being used on the front line. The experienced DPR, LPR troops were being used to assault in Mariupol, for example. But then he disclosed that these guys were holding defense lines around Kharkiv and got absolutely pasted because it turns out that war is a two-player game, and just because you put your troops on the defensive doesn't mean that your opponent won't detect that you've got a bunch of musicians holding a trench line and decide that maybe that's where they want to attack. And then those troops get absolutely decimated. Strelkov goes further. He's outright pessimistic when it comes to the training system. He basically says that even in the Imperial Russian Army, mobilized military personnel would undergo at least some minimal training in reserve units before being sent to the fight. This is even in the most desperate days of the Soviet Union or the Imperial Russian Army. There were some examples in the Soviet Union of militia units being thrown together, but for the most part, the idea that the peasant boy just got given a rifle and told to order charge is generally wrong. There was at least some abbreviated training program. Strelkov says that there's basically no such equivalent in Lugansk and Donetsk. Troops are basically being called up and they're being thrown into battle in the hope that, quote, they will learn everything themselves in a couple of days if they survive. And this has led, many observe, to a great dichotomy in the separatist forces. You've got those that were fighting since 2014, the regulars, the 44,000, who had been fighting the Ukrainians pretty continuously and kind of knew what they were doing. They're the ones who did a lot of the hard slogging in Mariupol and took a whole bunch of casualties doing it, but they were the ones doing a lot of the hard fighting. And then you've got the 60-year-old teachers, conservatories, retirees, people with back conditions, whose only job is kind of to make up the numbers, and they're getting pasted in significant numbers whenever they actually end up going into combat. And that's what the pro-Russian sources are telling us. And then there's the question of equipment. Now, I'm going to leave aside the low-hanging fruit around crowdfunding as a signal that things are going wrong here. I'm going to talk about the equipment that we can visually verify that has been supplied. To start with, the internet's a bit obsessed with the weapons themselves. Particularly, they're obsessed with people being given Mosin-Nagant rifles. I understand this. The Mosin-Nagant was originally designed as a 19th century rifle. It was updated a couple of times. It served through the First World War, the Second World War, and then it was meant to be replaced by the SKS, and then the AK-47, the AKM, the AK-74, the list goes on. This is an ancient piece of kit. It's a 5-round bolt-action rifle that really should have been retired from major frontline military service. Now, the question is, are these being given out in large numbers, or is obsolete equipment being given out in large numbers? And in assessing this, I am going to discard, for example, the opinions of those internet warriors who insist that the Mosins are being handed out because they are in fact better than Kalashnikovs. To quote that guy on the internet there, Mosin more accurate than AK, weapon of choice for killing Nazis in World War II, so why change it? The reason you should change it, for the record, is because a 30-round magazine is better than a 5-round magazine. A semi-automatic action or an automatic action is a lot better than a bolt action. Just no one wants a Mosin when they have Kalashnikovs, or for marksman duties when they have things like Dragunovs available. So if people are being handed Mosins, it means that there's a shortage of other things available, you would presume. And yet we have seen plenty of photographic and visual evidence of troops from the DPR and LPR being handed, in large numbers, Mosin rifles, and they're not all snipers. And then it's more than just rifles. If you look at the videos and the equipment, some of these guys basically resemble troops that were going into battle for the Tsar during the First World War, with the exception of the fact that they have helmets, and helmets weren't brought in Russia until later. When you look at pictures of these squads, you ask questions like, where are the squad support weapons? Where are the machine guns? Where's the communications equipment? Where's the anti-tank equipment? Where is so much as an RPG-7 or an RPG-2 or a PTRS anti-tank rifle? Where's the night vision equipment? Okay, they don't have night vision equipment. Even the regular Russians don't generally have night vision equipment. But you take my point. A lot of time when the media is saying, hey, look at these Russians with horrible equipment, and it is horrible equipment. In many cases, it's World War II or even older. They're not talking about regular Russian troops. They're talking about DPR, LPR proxies that Russia is pushing into service to make up for its infantry deficit. Now, it is hard to verify how some of these horribly equipped formations are being used and whether they're going into direct combat. We do have testimonials and first-hand accounts on both the Ukrainian side and the pro-Russian side of troops with bolt-action rifles being killed and those rifles being recovered after combat, or people with these horrible equipment sets going into battle. But we don't know whether they're at least attempting to keep them out of the front line. What we do know is that they are issuing large amounts of obsolete equipment to these guys to try and make up numbers. Which leads me to make the observation that Russia really is, in trying to make up numbers here, tending to deploy these DPR, LPR troops, in many cases, as cannon fodder. I'll warn you, if you do go on Telegram and start reading, a lot of the accounts make for really hard and confronting reading, even if you're on the Ukrainian side. There's allegations of the Russians using DPR, LPR conscripts to draw fire. That is, deliberately send the reservists forward, or the conscripts forward, in order to bait the Ukrainians into responding so that the Russians or the professional DPR troops can identify where the Ukrainian fire positions are and attack and neutralize them. There's claims from both sides about wide-scale use of alcohol and drugs in order to try and get these guys to overcome their fears and go forward, even though their chance of survival is very, very low. Strelkov talks extensively about separatist infantry being used in repeated frontal attacks. Not human wave offensives, but repeated frontal attacks, suicidal attacks, day in and day out on entrenched Ukrainian positions. And there's video evidence of troubling incidents, of mass casualty events amongst these forces. Khodakovsky, as I said earlier, doesn't focus on that so much. Khodakovsky says or suggests that the DPR, LPR, and the Russians are using these conscripts, these call-ups, these old guys and the medically disabled, that they're using them in defensive positions or in rear areas. But even Khodakovsky admits that in a number of occasions, what's then happened is the Ukrainian counterattacks have hit the positions held by those units, and they've done about as well as you'd expect. Whenever the Russian government is asked about this, it directs all queries to the separatist governments. They basically take no responsibility for this. So basically what I'm saying is the DPR LPR started with 44,000 men, and then they declared a massive mobilisation, which means you could easily be talking about 100,000 plus DPR LPR troops on the field, being used aggressively to make up for the infantry shortages that the Russian army has. It also explains why the Ukrainians might be outnumbered in the Donbass despite the relatively limited size of the Russian army and Ukrainian mobilization efforts. There are all of these additional troops, in inverted commas, from the separatist republics making up the numbers, along with the Chechens, along with the Wagner group mercenaries. And it also explains something about casualties. When the Ukrainians report on enemy casualties or destroyed vehicles, often the Russian government or Russian commentators will point out, hey, we don't use Mosins, or we don't operate tanks that old, in order to justify the fact that the Ukrainian reports must be fake. In reality, in a lot of cases, what's being destroyed are DPR LPR forces that use older and obsolete equipment that are operating alongside the Russian forces. So the Russians can say, yeah, sure, we didn't take any casualties. The Russian side did, but it was their proxies, these militias, that ultimately took a lot of those casualties. I guess what I'm saying here is that what Russia needs in the Donbass, dealing with urban centres, fortifications, deep trench lines, in places where it was fighting like Mariupol, built up urban areas, what they really need is they need more of Sergeant Bisepsky from before. They need these guys. They need the little green men, well-equipped, trained modern infantry. I mean, heck, at a push, I think they'd settle for this. These are some World War I German stormtroopers who, despite the horribly archaic equipment, were motivated, well-trained, and understood what was necessary in order to move forward quickly, seize a fortified position through the power of shock, to cooperate with artillery, to take the enemy by surprise, and then seize their positions and open up gaps for the rest of the army to push through. Instead, they've got this. They've got whatever they can pull together from Donetsk and Luhansk, and they're making up for the fact that they're not willing to go to general mobilization, or the Russian army is unwilling to expand itself, by drawing more and more troops from these separatist areas. Russia hasn't mobilized, but the DPR and LPR have mobilized to an extreme extent, and this is the natural result. So you then have to raise the question, and this is one to which I don't have a satisfactory answer, of why Russia hasn't passed more equipment onto these separatist and proxy forces. If Russia is relying very heavily on DNR, LNR troops in order to make up infantry numbers in the fighting at Mariupol, in the fighting around Kharkiv, in the fighting in the Donbass, why is it not able to transfer over shipments of AKs, squad support weapons, light artillery, body armor, helmets, all the sort of equipment that would make these units far more effective than they already are? Like I said, I don't have a satisfactory explanation for that. Russia has made the protection of the Donbass peoples an ostensible part of its casus belli, which makes me wonder why it seems to be so willing to throw them away with relatively minimal equipment. So why does any of this matter? Why have I gone off on a 10-minute discussion about the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and the very large militia forces that they have put at the disposal of the Russian Federation? The first thing is to say that when you account for the fact that these forces exist, a lot of things that we see on the battlefield begin to make more sense. The discrepancies in casualty claims, the comments around the use of conscripts and poor equipment, well, it's explained by the fact that they're being used largely by these separatist forces. It explains things like force ratios, wherein the Ukrainians constantly complain about being outnumbered in the Donbass. Yes, that's partly about how many troops the Ukrainians choose to commit to the Donbass, but it's also about the fact that the Russians that are now concentrated there are heavily augmented by these sort of separatist forces. It also helps explain something about Russian difficulties and successes. Difficulties in the sense that understanding the shortage of Russian infantry is one element. Just one element, interpreted through the fog of war, that helps us understand some of what we have seen as this military operation has unfolded. But the presence of these very large forces from the separatist regions also helps explain why in the east of the country, why at Mariupol, why at Severodonetsk, why at around Kharkiv, there has been a greater ability for Russian and Russian-aligned forces to stand their ground, to occupy positions, and to take ground than we saw when they were attacking out of Belarus towards Kyiv. It also allows us to do a little bit more of a realistic appraisal of the Russian army in many ways. We can look at these images and keep in mind that we're not looking at images of the Russian army. The Russian army isn't this decrepit, or at least we don't have evidence to suggest it's this decrepit. These are separatist forces that are serving essentially as allied and proxy units. So we need to be careful when we're making our evaluations of how powerful and what the standard of your average Russian unit is. Let's be very careful as to whether or not we're evaluating a DNR unit, an LPR unit, a Wagner unit, or are we evaluating a unit of the Russian Federation itself? Finally, it's important because it's clear that this can't really go on forever, which leads to the question of sustainability in this mobilization. A shortage of infantry limits military options. In terms of the options that Russia has available to it and how it chooses to conduct itself on its battlefield, the tactics that it has chosen to adopt, focusing on very heavy artillery shelling to push back and pulverize opponents and only then move forward and occupy, and moving in these short stints, reduces the premium on Russia to need to have large bodies of trained, capable infantry to go clear urban agglomerations. If you just blast those agglomerations apart, it's relatively simple for your depleted infantry corps to go take. And in the meantime, the Russian military finds itself occupying something of a twilight zone. It's forced to fight in ways that it didn't train for and practice for because its doctrine never assumed that it would fight a war like this one at peacetime strength. So ultimately, it's that insistence on calling this a special military operation, on failing to really get serious about generating additional forces, about being honest about the need to deploy additional troops, and yes, to be able to deploy conscript troops into Ukraine, that has crippled the Russian army's infantry corps and its ability to fight the way it trains to fight. And so, unless something changes, like so many times before in history, because of political decisions that have been made in the Kremlin or in St. Petersburg, the Russian army finds itself relying on under-equipped, under-trained foot sloggers to make up for a discrepancy in pre-war planning, pre-war thinking, and execution during an ongoing conflict. All right, channel update to close out. And as always, I'm going to open with thanks. Thanks for the ongoing messages of support, for the comments and the other forms of support that come through every time I put through a video. There are, of course, a small number of interesting messages that come through. I put one example down the bottom of the screen there just so you know what that looks like from my perspective. But for the most part, I've been absolutely overwhelmed by the support I continue to receive. And just because I know some of you listen to this rather than watch the slides, I will read you this lovely email from Vladimir Bus 1993. Quote, "Your channel is 100% bullshit, not covering any of Ukraine army war crimes. Simple suggestions without any fact-checking, no numbers, no nothing. And your logistic analysis is a bunch of crap. You simply a pro-Ukrainian dummy." There has been no full stops by this point, by the way. This is just chained commas. "You simply a pro-Ukrainian dummy making BS content without any bleeping common sense. Die from cancer. I wish you only suffering. Winky face." Thank you, Vladimir Bus 1993, for your valuable contribution. I will take that feedback on board. The video on Poland was very well received by those of you who watched it. I kind of knew when I put it out that being a bit more of a niche topic, it wasn't going to get the same play that some of the large-scale economic analysis videos get. But I like being able to cover topics that are missed by the mainstream media and that deserve a little bit more attention. So even though the view count is a little bit lower, expect me to continue going in and doing those sort of topics in the future. I have been receiving some great advice and support that I want to call out here. So Nicholas Moran, the chieftain in particular, has been giving me some fantastic advice from an old hand of YouTube, so to speak. In terms of upcoming topics, this was the first look at mobilization, looking at the Russian side, the shortage of infantry that Russia is facing. The Ukrainian army has a very, very different mobilization experience, which is why I think it deserves its own coverage at some point in the future. I also want to go back and revisit the economics of this conflict a little bit more. That does deserve, I think, a 100-day update, looking both at Russia and Ukraine. How are they both holding up? And of course, I continue to work on making the myth-busting and propaganda video as best as that can be. This was, in fact, a spin-off, if you like, of the myth-busting video. It was an attempt to deal with the myths of the Russian army is terrible, or the Russian army is using Mosin-Nagants, or the Russian army is or isn't massively outnumbered by the Ukrainians, for example. I wanted to pull a lot of those together and explain them in one way because the common factor is the presence of DNR and LNR forces and how they sort of skew the media perception of the conflict and how they impact numbers on the ground. So that video is still very much in creation. I'm working on it. I don't have a release schedule for it at the moment, but I'm going to continue working on it. In the meantime, thank you so much for your ongoing support of the channel. Thank you for subscribing, liking, supporting me on Patreon. And as a final note, if you are interested in any of my gaming content, I have just started posting episodes of a new series on a demo for the upcoming game Terra Invicta. It's a fantastic sci-fi grand strategy game. So if you are interested or want to check out the demo, please hop over to my gaming channel. I put a link in the description. Apart from that, all I can say is thank you once more, and I'll see you again soon.